I would like to start with asking you about the origin of this piece and its title that it's so evocative. Where does it come from?
So the piece, I actually began developing the work around 5-6 years ago. Prior to that, just a bit of background, like lots of my work was very tied to my own experience. Previously working as a photographer and working in conflict zones and working with press and making more documentary styled work. And then moving into making my own art, which often was, again, still based on my own experiences. And I found that lots of my work evolved around my perception of the world. And around the election of Donald Trump in the US, I was kind of motivated by looking at not my own experience, but in general how these large political shifts could set a whole sensation in motion for basically most people in the world, and kind of participate and comment on that, on what was that doing both to me, but also in general, how did that make me feel, and how did I see that the world was reacting to it. And so I started making work that it wasn't necessarily around my experience, but it was a comment to what I was experiencing. And so this piece grew out of something that was trying to be more general about humanity and the state of humanity today. And at the same time, I was doing a lot of research and interested in this topic called existential risks, which is basically, it's a topic where you study such large threats that could actually mean the end of humanity as we know it. Mm-hmm. And at the time, this is 5-6 years ago, the pandemic hadn't happened. But one of the things that is considered an existential risk, apart from like the Hollywood scenarios of like asteroids hitting the Earth and major volcanoes, things like that, one very serious threat is biotechnology, and actually what that could do to humanity if some kind of a disease was released into society that would result in society changing profoundly or even coming to an end. Other risks evolve around artificial intelligence and our kind of lack of regulation within the realm of artificial intelligence. And so I was within the realm of existential risks. There is something called the Fermi Paradox, which basically has this idea that could it be that there's a reason why we've never been or never have seen nor have been contacted by life from any other place in the universe as far as we know, and perhaps it's due to the fact that there is something which is known as the great filter, which means when a certain society knows to a certain level of intelligence, their own intelligence also becomes their own destruction. And so I found that to be kind of an evocative thought. And looking at where we are today, technologically speaking, but still with a certain lack of wiseness about how to actually deal with our own technology and our own intelligence, could this be that we are heading into the great filter? And so the piece that we have here is kind of it's posing that question. It's not concluding anything. It's not a doomsday piece as such, mm-hmm. But it's more bringing these things to the forefront, which aren't necessarily, conspiracy theories, nor based on fiction or Hollywood, as we see now with the pandemic. That's something, supposedly so small, beginning supposedly in a market in China, can all of a sudden affect every single person in this world. Mm-hmm. And so the piece kind of became even more relevant because it was like, this is part of what I'm, talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting that you're focusing at that point on a matter of scale, because your piece is playing with a scale, right? You're thinking about a model for a city somehow.
Right. I mean, it's using the classic grid, which references both to the modern city, the layout of the modern city, the architectural layout of the city, but it's also about the way that we control humanity's way of controlling nature, and our way of everything fits into these boxes, and it is this grid. And so in that sense, this can be seen as as a miniature version of a city. Whereas each, it's kind of the repetition is based on one shape. It's the same mold that is used for the repetition of all of this. However, with the destruction of these, call them buildings, each gets its own personality and its own story and whatever happened there, and everything kind of is collapsing in a more natural way where nature goes in and takes over.
Yeah, giving it this sense of ruin somehow.
Right.
Where we live together with these ruins, which
right.
is such an interesting sensation, because when again you were talking about the grid of a modern city, and the questions that you were bringing for in the beginning relate so much to this crisis of modernity that we are experiencing, right, between the tension between culture and nature.
Right.
And so it's so evocative, this notion of nature reclaiming or reimagining what a landscape looks like.
Sure.
I don't know how you felt with images that circulated this year, like empty cities during the lockdown,
right.
for example.
Right.
No?
Yeah. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that, right down to my own practice of allowing natural processes to take over. That you work up to a certain point where you have control, and then you kind of let go of that control. And then there are things that are just far greater than us that start taking over, and in my opinion are far more at times far more poetic. If you really allow nature to take over, how beauty kind of develops and takes shape. And the same goes with this. I can control part of the process. Thereafter, the thing of throwing, I mean, I have something to say about that, but really it depends on the velocity of the material. There's so many factors that play in that that's no longer in my control. And so you have this feeling of what, the force of nature and what that can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And the poetics also translate to the way your work fits or plays with art history, right? Because being the grid such a compositive, such a model of composition, not only for modern art, meaning
sure.
painting with of course Mondrian, the Mondrian tradition, but also with minimalist art, right? And what the grid
right.
means there in terms of control of the materials and the situation in which this grid becomes impossible and its own materiality
right.
becomes to collapse is super interesting in particular.
I mean, I try with the work to take it beyond it being a work that is a comment on art history as such. And my aim also within the exhibition here at MAD would be that the audience in general would somehow be able to relate to this work. With or without any background and knowledge of art. And you could see that just in the, you could easily translate this to be someone could relate to it because of their own experience of making sandcastles, right down to that, and up to, you're saying, actually someone who knows about art history and could speak about how this fits into, the history of minimalism and the grid in general, how it's been used.
Well, yeah, it's the multi-layer capacity of our work, right? To speak
right.
to different audiences, which is something that, as a curator, we value a lot. And in particular, not only the value in talking to different audiences, but something interesting about this exhibition is how it relates to its topic, right? So when you presented first this work, it was in a pavilion, right? And then here we are working in a recontextualization. In this exhibition, in which we are doing a critical revision on the industry of tourism, right?
Right.
And so the interesting thing about it is how much the circulation of urban imaginaries happens through the marketing rhetorics of tourism, and how that has molded and shaped how we see urban life and how we see cultural difference.
Right.
And it's so interesting to have your work here in dialogue with so many pieces that are either commentaries on tourism specifically or on how landscape has changed so much over the last 100 years with the expansion of tourism and international traveling, that I think it adds a particular component to your work and how it will be received in this city that also kind of speaks very clearly to its matter. We're right in front of the beach, right?
Completely.
And in this city that it's one of the most touristic in Argentina.
Sure.
And talking about that, I would like to hear what you think about this recontextualization, but also it's interesting you've been living in Argentina for 10 years, you were saying, and but you've been exhibiting mostly in Europe.
Yep.
So how do you feel about having this exhibition here?
I mean, no, this is a huge honor. Like, literally, like, I've been producing work for so many years here, but never had a window to actually show it. And lots of my, I've often been up against, like, my work needs to be compact so I could bring it with me, or it needs to be of a certain shape or form that I travel to Europe and I finalize it there. But this idea of actually, quote unquote, being able to take something out of my studio and place here, I mean, that's a dream to be able to actually show it here. I mean, honestly, Argentina has been the place that I've lived the longest in one place during my life. And so I have a strong attachment to the country.
Of course. And do you feel that how do you feel as a foreign artist? Has it been difficult to be a part of the scene here, or how have you navigated that?
I've never participated as such in the scene. And that's partially, a choice I've made in general with my work. Now, that's to say I don't participate much in the scene either in Europe, except for having my work shown and having representation there. And it's mainly for my work to keep it, saying it's pure sounds wrong, and but keeping it from not being influenced by, by the thought that there is happening right in this moment. I try to keep my work more open and more universal. And so in general, I haven't been participating that much. I do, know certain artists, but I get as much, living in Argentina out of, being around non-artists basically, and getting it, at times far more influence and inspiration that way around.
Well, you actually have your studio right in the countryside.
Right.
So you like to work in isolation.
Yes. I mean, that has been not that I like it just as much as just before I didn't have a family, now that I have a family, but before, probably the most key component in my production was solitude. So it was isolating myself for long periods of time to produce. And that was kind of a tool that I used. Now with a family, I can't just go away and shut myself in for months at a time without calling. And so, but I've done it to the extent of what was possible, which was then to isolate myself in a village, and kind of work out from that point.
Yeah.
And be more, I mean, I'm in a small village there where I could have landed from Mars, and I would, I'm definitely not a local, but at the same time, I can kind of keep to myself in a way.
Absolutely, and this I would say this kind of pursued feeling of estrangement that you are describing, and also the word solitude that you just mentioned, seem to be two keys in your work, also in the iconography you play with, right?
Right.
In your photographic work before,
sure.
There's these solitary landscapes.
For sure.
How have you been exploring that?
Well, I mean, so you take Argentina, if you look at at the population in Argentina, I mean, this is an empty country. There's such vastness where there's no people around. So, there's an overabundance of space. I've never, that's what I love so much about, living in La Pampa and in that area, because it's just, there's a stillness in there. There's a silence as well in that landscape that I appreciate so much. And, and if I haven't been able to find it, or if I've wanted something else, then I've traveled to Patagonia. and I spent, long periods of time there photographing and working with photography, but also in general just picking up inspiration and being, lots of what you get out of solitude isn't necessarily anything concrete you can stand and hold in your hands. It's a process, it's a way of dealing with yourself, it's a way of, of exploring your relationship to the place. Mm-hmm. And so that, is a key component in my work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so palpable, and at the same time I was thinking about the sort of phantasmatic quality in some of your images that come not only from the fact that there is not anyone in particular in the images that you are proposing, but at the same time how that allows for a focus on materiality, or how that allows for a focus on the history of either the geological formation of the mountains you are photographing, or different notions of time perception in the in looking at the work.
I mean, often I think someone who does appreciate those types of landscapes and solitude as well, is it gives you a different relationship to time and how you relate to time and how you see time shaping the world that we know, and how much, how, if you go to a landscape, which there's plenty of, especially in South America, where there's no reference to humans being there. You might have some in agricultural things, but there's lots of landscapes where you just don't have anything. You could be living 10,000 years ago, or hopefully you're living 10,000 years in the future as well. And, that's fascinating. That thing of like taking us out of this time that we're in right now and trying to see it, a bit, zoom out a little bit and see it from a bit far distance. It at least for me, it makes you a little more humble, to the landscape, but also to the time that we're living in, and, the role that we play in our interaction with nature.
Yeah. Yeah, in that way you're getting close to the description of the sublime, but which I think it's in any case not so present in your work, that I appreciate so much for its also its lack of pretension, I would say, right? You tend to work with precarious materials or very artisanal work,
right?
And kind of focused landscapes. Even here, when you're playing with a large installation, your module is really modest at the same time. Right. The component.
Yeah.
So there's a rescaling, right, between your perception of the landscape and how you communicate that to your audience.
I think I tend to think of it as more being a realistic way of looking at the world. And, when you say sublime, that, for me at least, takes me to notions of like, the romantic vision of nature, and I don't agree with that, because that is something, again, we are placing on top of it. Like, nature is not necessarily romantic. It's brutal, it's harsh, it's terrible. Climate change today, I mean, the climate and the nature doesn't care about the destruction it's causing. It's a reactionary element. And so with my work, I try to have that same, because I still find a beauty within there. I find something that, that makes me stop up and like, think about, our place in the world. But it doesn't necessarily need to be like, you want to be bathed in it, you want to also see the tough reality of it. And so in that sense, like lots of the choice of my materials, because the thing that's just evident within nature is the ephemeral. It's things that are constantly changing, constantly breaking down, and certain things that are, building up, but will eventually collapse as well. And as much as I can try to kind of capture that and try to communicate that, I find I get closer and closer to, to achieving what it is that I want to achieve with my work.
And in that sense, going in that direction, what has been your relationship to research in terms of materiality?
In terms of materiality, it's I try a lot to use locally sourced materials and try to find a tradition within wherever I am working, and try to see like what is it here that there is, and use very accessible materials, call it that. So, it can be materials taken from industry, for example, or it can be materials sourced. Like right now, I'm working on extracting pigments from plants. And so I'm looking at whatever plants there are around me, and I, do this process, which is a very simple process, but basically, it's take out the colors of these plants. And so, again, it forces me to be attentive about what's around me. And that's been, a learning curve for me, because when I first moved to Argentina, I was used to working and producing in Europe, where, basically I could get anything. If it wasn't, I could order it and it would get shipped, or, in Italy they have this thing, you get it. And then, when I came to Argentina, that wasn't possible. It was a lot more limited about the materials, and that kind of became like a stumbling or like a challenge. And as years passed by, I learned to really appreciate that and not try to be like insisting on what I want, but to try to more go with the flow, like, this is what's being presented now. And this work is a perfect example. I mean, I had, created a work similar to this before with materials that had slightly different colors, but it happens to be that the sand that there is here in Mar del Plata is a dark type of a sand. Hence the work comes out, darker and has kind of the signature of this local area.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
And that, I think it's super important to embrace those things.
Yeah, which brings us back to the feeling of vulnerability in a different sense. But you were describing that in relation to these risk factors for the future of humanity, and then you are also describing the vulnerability that you have as an artist in terms of what you work with.
Yes.
Which also relates to the fragility in the materiality.
Sure.
And its ephemerality at the same time, because this is a monumental installation, but at the same time one has the feeling that a little wind could ruin everything.
Right.
Which is something you're looking after, right? You're going for in that direction.
Well, I'm going for creating that. I'm going for creating that tension with the audience, so that anyone who interacts with this work is somehow influenced down to a physical level with it. That you don't just stay in an intellectual or just, do you like it or not like it, but actually that you have that feeling of like, if I touch it, it might, collapse. Mm-hmm. And I've always tried to incorporate that element, that your interaction with my work requires a physical interaction, because the physicality is such an important part of my own practice. Like, it's something I incorporate. This work is a lot about endurance. It's about seeing something through, almost, as a meditative element, but it's very important to me that I'm making this, and not that we had, if it existed a big machine that came in and stamped it, then it wouldn't have the essence that I'm looking for. And so the more that I can kind of translate that or give that, pass that on to an audience, the better, that they kind of feel a little bit about that they also stop up and look at this work from a production standpoint of this actually having been created by hands. Mm-hmm. Because there's so much that we take for granted in that sense of everything around us, all things that are produced, all things that in a modern world, we're just being served, and the whole history of what comes behind you actually wearing that clothes with that color, there's a lot of factors that play in that. In a certain way, it's a miracle, mm-hmm. That we have access to so many different things.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the same time, you were talking about interaction, but you were describing more than an interaction, need to be cautious or a restriction of the self in the impulse of interacting with the piece more closely, right? You were saying if I touch it, it might collapse.
Right.
And that's a really interesting play, also like teasing.
Sure.
Teasing the feeling.
Right.
Right.
I mean, between you and me, this work won't collapse if you touch it. But I mean, and I've actually invited people no, you can try to touch it. And even they're like, I'm standing there, I made it, I'm telling you, you can touch it. People are still like, yeah, I better not. And so then it's okay, then it's convincing.
Of course, of course. Well, and you were describing your process in working in creating this piece and kind of highlighting the artisanal process, which brings to the piece such a corporeal quality, and it's so interesting to see you work on it and how there is such a first a repetitive movement that has a sort of meditative component, if you want, in the sense of a commitment to the piece, but at the same time there is also this play with hazard and how you go, how you throw the sand and the piece to create this feeling of erosion.
Right.
Do you see that? Do you see this performative component as part of the piece, or are you interested in sharing this? Or
it's a good question. I mean, it's something that's I've considered it a lot, and I would, you know, I'd say it like this: like, yes, it is an important part, and I guess you could call it performative, but it's not something that is, let's say, performative for an audience, if that makes sense. So it's more performative for myself, if that makes sense, you know? Like, when I stand back and this work is finally completed, it does have that story to it that you can get from, you know, from performance art. But it would be wrong to, let's say, invite an audience. It would kind of make it more pretentious than it should be. And there's something about this being created, I mean, I guess ideally is that it was created almost in darkness and only by myself. And then the lights, you know, there was nothing and the lights came on, there it was. And it was so almost as if it was, you knew it had happened, but you weren't able to actually witness the actual creation of it. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, absolutely. When we're thinking about the performative, I'm not thinking about this being a stage for an audience to be present, but rather on how the body has modified the objects, and that is something you want to give traces of.
Sure. Well, I mean, however I feel when I'm making it, which, you know, gives all of a sudden attention to your own emotions throughout a day, will reset, you know, it will feed into the work that I'm making, because however fast I'm throwing, you know, all of these elements, if something is hurting, it has an influence on the work. And it's something that I'm very aware of. I mean, I'm very aware of the physical aspect of creating these types of works, because it requires, you know, for your attentiveness to not just your physical body, but also like your mental state, and to see how that's influencing, and to, you know, to be focused. I mean, that's really what this work is in the creation part of it is all about. You know, it's about maintaining that type of a focus, and then, you know, not losing it.
Focus that comes with such an emphasis on de-acceleration at the same time.
Right.
Which I think it's fascinating in terms of how this piece will be perceived in the scale of this room, and the need to really make a transit around it, to appreciate how it changes with light, to appreciate how it changes with the relationship of other works.
Sure. I mean, I would strongly recommend, first of all, when you do see this work, that you do spend time as you would, you know, you use the word meditative, but kind of observing something that seems very neutral, almost as if like observing a gray wall and seeing where that takes you, and seeing the different shades that there are within there. Because it's the same with this, an instant, you know, look at it, it looks as if it's one shape. But once you choose a certain sector of it, you start seeing all of these individualities within it. And that's, you know, is interesting. And the second thing is, it seems to be a work that upon a second or third view changes as well. You know, you're seeing something new every time that you experience it.
Yeah, which is one of the best things that we can say about an artwork, and how we think it will perform.
Right. Yeah. If it continues to evolve somehow, and then I think there's a strength to the fact that this is a site-specific work that only exists for the period of time that it's here, and thereafter, you know, it basically disappears and is destroyed. it gives it that, you know, time frame as well. That it, you know, it comes up to exist and then, you know, it's, you know, it fades out.
It's gone. The city is absolutely eroded.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe you find it on the beach or something. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Adam.
You're welcome.